So a couple of years after starting the church in Chicago, a church for me, I had made connections in the community, and a group of mental health providers asked if I would come and present to them and a number of interns and respond to one of their questions, because they had understood that the ministry that we had there in Chicago, a Church for Me Metropolitan Community Church, we had a particular ministry that served an awful lot of individuals who felt one way or another marginalized by faith, by friends, by family, by society. Many because they identified as LGBTQ, but not exclusively. There were some people who it was because of addiction or because of other places that they found themselves on life's journey. But one way or another, we had this incredible ministry, still have this incredible ministry in Chicago. And so this group of mental health providers asked if I'd come and address this conference. And so I thought about this question, because the question that they wanted me to answer was, what are the challenges? What are the challenges that people face who feel marginalized because of faith and religion and spirituality? And as I prepared for that presentation, and the more I thought about it, it ultimately occurred to me, and this is how I opened the presentation: there is but one challenge. It doesn't matter whether you feel completely comfortable within tradition, whether you've never felt ostracized or marginalized at all in your life, if you feel like you have power or privilege, or whether you feel like you are an outcast or marginalized. Every one of us face this similar challenge. And the question that we have is this: is faith, spirituality, and religion a source of healing, wholeness, hope, and love? Or is it a force further fragmenting our hearts, minds, bodies, community, spirits, and soul? That is the challenge that we all face. And for me, I think that that's what this story and our stories and these stories are all about. You see, if you think back to this wonderful text that we have, this story about Jesus and the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, there are people before him and behind him in this grand procession. They've been waiting for a long, long time for the long-awaited Messiah, the one who they believe will what? Return things to the way they were. Restore the people and the city and their state to the place of power and privilege and comfort. They're looking for someone who is going to return things and make them great again. Enter Jesus. Jesus enters into our lives and into our story, meets us right wherever we are, somewhere on this particular journey, enters into this particular story, enters into the city, and ultimately into the temple, and ultimately into our lives. You know, Gandhi, according to his grandson Arun, would have been totally comfortable. He had trained as a lawyer. He had planned to go to South Africa and to make his fortune. He had no intentions on becoming a peacemaker, on leading India to independence. But within 24 hours of having arrived in South Africa, riding on a train, there were people who literally threw him off of the train because they thought his skin was too dark. He tells the story and says that he stood there dusting himself off, and his first thought was he was so incredibly angry. He wanted that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of justice. He wanted vengeance against the people who had thrown him off with such hate and animosity. And then a second thought occurred to him, he says. He thought he'd just give up, go back to the people of India and make his way back there. And then, as the train moved off further and further into the distance, he thought there has to be another way. Because either of those two paths, to hold on with fists clenched hard to all of that anger and bitterness and hurt, or to quietly walk away would leave him one way or another feeling completely empty inside, kind of like Jesus' fig tree. And so Gandhi began reading and studying all of the world's great religions, all of the different philosophies that were out there. And ultimately, he settled on the words and the teachings of this guy named Jesus. He found that within Jesus' story, within the wisdom that was shared, he found a path, a third way, a way in which love is created by loving others, in which justice is found by creating justice for others. From that point forward, he began to meditate every single day on the words of the great old hymn, The Old Rugged Cross. For me, when I follow this story in this great procession, time is really, really short. Like, Jesus knows, this is the last week of his earthly life. Really, really urgent. And so they enter into the great city of Jerusalem, and they go down to the temple, but it's late. He looks around, and it's really, really late. So they go off and they stay with some friends in Bethany. And then they return, and a new day dawns. And they're heading off with great urgency down to the temple. And somewhere on that way, all of a sudden, Jesus is hungry and sees this fig tree over in the distance and decides to step aside. In the middle of everything that this week is going to be, with all of this great urgency, Jesus turns aside and finds the time to chew out a fig tree. What is that all about? Years later, asked if he thought so highly of this guy named Jesus, why wasn't Gandhi a Christian? Gandhi is reported to have said, "I like your Christ. It's your Christians I could do without." And I think that is the point of this story, of these stories, of the barren fig tree and the turned over tables, and why Jesus, though he's hungry, makes it a point to stop along the way. Think about it. In a couple of weeks from now, say that you're out at some orchard somewhere here in New England, and you're really hungry, and you go up to an apple tree, and the leaves are all green, and the flowers are there blooming. Are you going to expect that there's an apple there? No, because why? It's not in season. And we're told that it wasn't the season for figs. Then why is Jesus so angry? It's got to be more than he's just hangry. Right? That's the kind of anger that we get when we're really, really hungry and we can't think straight. This is Jesus. And quite frankly, whether you believe that he's just this really incredible wise prophet or that he is the Son of God incarnate, one way or another, I have to imagine that somebody within that time and in that context would understand when figs are in season. After chewing out the fig tree, they head on to the temple. And there you know the story. There are these tables and there are these money changers. And he turns them over and he gets really angry. And he quotes the prophet Isaiah and he quotes the prophet Jeremiah. My house should be a house of prayer for all people. He resurrects God's vision of what religion and our story and humanity is supposed to be all about. No divisions, no outcasts. No injustice or marginalized among us. My house of prayer should be a house of prayer for all people. I think what Jesus is up to is he is pointing out that like that fig tree, that over time what ends up happening is our institutions become so focused on themselves that we lose focus of what our core purpose and what God's vision is in the first place. Initially, there was nothing wrong with those tables there in the temple in the courtyard. They were actually put there in order to create more access for people and not less. You see, the pilgrims would have to come from miles and miles and miles away in order to get to the temple. And initially, they would have to bring whatever it is that they were going to offer up for their sacrifices in order to earn grace and seek forgiveness. And so the money changers allowed them to come and travel lightly so they wouldn't be burdened down with all of these animals and things that they were going to give to the temple for slaughter. But over time, the purpose had become forgotten, and the people were starting to be taken advantage of. You know, there's a funny thing about fig trees. Too much sun or not enough sun, too much living water or not enough living water, and you can have all of these beautiful green leaves, and you're not going to get any fruit. And I think that that's what Jesus is all about. What Jesus is saying in this time, in this day, when things are so incredibly short, is that we need to focus on how it is that we return to God's vision and let God's vision be resurrected within us. Unlike the fig tree, the season for us to be bearing fruit is always and forever. In God's temple, every day is the season when grace ought to be offered. In God's temple, every day ought to be the day when justice is the thing that we are seeking. Every day ought to be the day when we welcome in the stranger and we feed the hungry who are passing by. Those who are physically hungry and spiritually hungry and hungry to hear the word that God truly loves them for who they are. For 50 years, that has been the ministry of Metropolitan Community Churches. For nearly almost as long, that has been the ministry of MCC Boston. And yet, we live in a time when youth suicides are up, when the addiction rates are out of control, and when so many people in this city, in your neighborhoods, in our community, feel lost and isolated and so incredibly alone. We can be enamored by all of the gimmicks and all of the shiny things like all of those beautiful green leaves, or we can focus and dig deep, reroot ourselves in God's vision, in God's dream, and follow this grand procession with Jesus as the lead. There are people in our city who are passing by, and the question is, are we willing to join the procession? Are we willing to do what is necessary to tear down and turn over a couple of tables, to let go of all of our own desires when we hunger for restoration or the return of the way things used to be, and instead commit us to see and to live and to be different? We live in a time filled with fear. If God's house of prayer should be a house of prayer for all people, then what that means to me is when we hear in our society, in our community, in our city, in our nation, and in our world, the rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric that so many people are using, that say people from certain countries don't belong, that people who practice certain religions don't belong, that people who look differently or act differently or love differently somehow don't belong. We have to rise up and say, quite frankly, that is wrong. God is the God of love. God's love extends to every single person. And if I understand what the vision and the ministry of MCC has always been about, it is for us to return ourselves to make faith and spirituality in this story a story which is a force for good, the source of healing and hope and love for all God's children, no matter where they are or what they've been told or who says they belong. May God continue to bless us and guide us and encourage us on this journey.